So today, as I mentioned, is the last day of kind of the consumer, what have you. And so what we're going to be looking at is behavioral economics. In the grand scheme of things, this is relatively, I'm going to say, new. And I say that it's kind of a reversion to the past, if you will, in some cases. What happened in the, I'm going to say, from the 40s to the 90s, whatever, is economics became very math and very, hey, let's put it in an equation and try to do that. And in order to do that, what we did is we made some assumptions about people, okay? We assumed, and we've assumed this so far, that you have things like stable preferences, i.e. it doesn't change. So what that means is, going back to a couple of weeks ago, if you like steak over hamburgers, even if you've had steak for a week in a row, you're still going to prefer steak over hamburgers, where you might prefer that hamburger at that point, okay? So we've made some assumptions here in economics that, going back in our models, what have you, we thought were correct. And now there's more of a desire or what have you to start to question some of these, okay? People are eager and accurate calculating machines. You know exactly what you want, okay? And you know exactly how to do things. And what we found is that that's not exactly the case, okay? People are good planners who possess a lot of willpower, and that gets to our nudges, our discussion board, what have you, for today. And keep in mind, what we find is that people don't have a lot of willpower. Okay, there are people, many of them sitting in class, that'll say, why should I save for retirement? That's 40 years away. All my buds are going to Florida for spring break. Why shouldn't I go? It's only a couple $100. In the grand scheme of things, that's not going to be the end of the world. I'm going to go to Florida. I'm going to have a good time, what have you. We'll save for retirement tomorrow, okay? And then you get to be in your 20s, 30s, or 30s, 40s, and you have kids, and you go, well, I'd rather take them on a vacation or do whatever than save for retirement. And then the next thing you know, we're 50 and we're going, oh crud, we've saved absolutely nothing for retirement. And the reason is we didn't have the willpower, we didn't have the desire. Okay, those things that are far in the future, i.e. retirement, weren't on the radar. Okay, and then finally, the things we've kind of assumed is that people are, and I hate the word necessarily selfish or self-interested, but we kind of made that assumption. Okay, and what economists really struggled with is, why would you give to a charity if you could, what's going to give you more pleasure, to go back to our discussion of a couple of weeks ago, giving to a charity or spending money on yourself, perhaps for that trip to Florida, perhaps for whatever else. And what we find is that people aren't totally selfish, okay? Which is not what we would have anticipated. What we would have anticipated is them to be, if you will, more selfish, and to, I'm going to say, look out for number one to make sure. And we find that they're not. And so what we try to do now in economics is, how do we answer some of these? And so this idea of behavioral economics has come about because of that. Okay. And so what behavioral economics does is it focuses on the mental process behind decisions. How do you make the decisions you make? Okay. And then how can we improve outcomes by improving decision making? Some of those things, such as nudges. Okay. And I'm going to probably save discussing the discussion board till the end of class today. But that's kind of the idea behind this. Okay. So when you take a look at the two, okay, neoclassical being the old school, if you will, and behavioral economics, okay, the more recent, okay, what we find is that we're not all making lists, making preferences, making choices, okay? I don't know about y'all, but my wife hates sending me to the grocery store because there's always extra stuff that finds its way into my cart. And yes, sometimes it's beer, but sometimes it's cookies, okay? Maybe a donut for breakfast, who knows what it is, okay? And that's what behavioral economics says. Behavioral economics says you send Mr. Sass with a list, okay? There's still going to be some of those impulse purchases as he goes through, that grocery store, okay? And keep in mind, the supermarkets know this all too. When you enter a supermarket, you go in through the fresh produce almost all the time. They know that. Why? Because if they can get you to put the asparagus or the broccoli or the lettuce into your cart, you now feel good about yourself. You now think, hey, I'm doing pretty good. I'm eating pretty healthy. I can go ahead and put those Oreos in, or that donut in, or that frozen pizza in my cart, because you know what? I started off this in this shopping experience really good. And so what we find is that these two things, the neoclassical and the behavioral, work together. Okay, it helps explain what's going on. Okay, so taking a look at kind of compare and contrast, I'm just going to point out a couple of these items, and we're going to talk about a couple of them here in the next couple of minutes. One is the stability of your preferences. The neoclassical folks say, oh, those preferences don't change. Behavioral economics say they do. Okay, and it depends upon things like the framing effect, and we're going to talk about that here today. Okay, but those are one of the big differences. Another one is the ability for you to make mental calculations. Okay, and what we find is that when we're faced with making quick calculations, we often make some assumptions, and they're frequently not correct. Okay. Things such as saving for retirement. People are just as good at accessing future options as current options. That says you should have a perfect idea of how much to save for retirement. You should be doing it. Okay. But what we find is that people don't put enough weight on the future. They don't save enough. You look at all the evidence, it says that as Americans, we don't save enough for retirement. Okay. So when you start to look at the difference between neoclassical and behavioral, you start to see it's kind of a yin and a yang, and what have you. Hey, people have no trouble resisting temptation, or people lack willpower and often fall prey to temptation. I'm guilty party number one. Okay. I mean, it's gotten to be such a joke in the Sass household that when I come home from the grocery store, my wife almost asks, let me see what else you got. Let me see what else you put on the list or put on, because I know what was on the list and I'm going to go through and see what was added. She never complains, mind you. Okay. She never complains, but it's just a matter of me adding to that list, if you will. And so this is the first one and how we look at things. When you look at the three men on, and I'm assuming they're men, obviously, on the screen there, do they look to be the same or different heights? Anybody? There's going to be some options for doing some talking today, so.
They look the same, but they look at different viewpoints. They're all different.
And they are, I mean, you've kind of hit both sides. They look like they're different. The one on the far right looks to be the smallest. Okay. The one on that side looks to be, at least from my perspective, the largest. They are all the same size, believe it or not. It's just a matter of how they look because of the way the lines are drawn, the rectangles there are drawn, what have you. So even though they're all the same size, they look to be very different. Okay. And that's one of the things that we're getting here at the behavioral economics. Hey, we think you're rational and you could say, oh, those all are the same. But are they? Okay. And the reason why we use these heuristics is they save energy. Okay, if you talk to the biologists, our brain uses amongst the most energy of all the organs in our body. And what it does, what these heuristics do, is they save us time. So when you look at what I have here on the board, what does that look like? Anybody? Does it look like 12, 13, 14? Anybody out there? Anybody out there? Anybody want to? Hazard a guess? No? No brave souls? Is that a 13 or a B? Boy, you are not talkative today, are y'all?
Okay, I'll talk. That's how my B's look when I make a B. So I guess a B.
But and yeah, it looks like, but the problem is when you see it between a 12 and a 14, what does it then look like?
It looks like a 13.
And yet when I draw it this way, it looks like a
B, but it would be a 13, right?
There's not a right, yeah, the one thing there's not a right or a wrong answer, but when you look at it one direction, you go, oh man, okay, that looks like a B. But when you go 12, 13, 14, you put it in that context. And keep in mind, our brain does this all the time. Okay, our brain does this all the time. Okay, it tries to make sense of what it sees based upon what's around it. And when you see things like this, ABC makes sense. And when you see things like this, 12, 13, 14 makes sense. It doesn't make sense to put a B in the middle of between 12 and 14. So our brains do this. Okay, and so when you think about how your brain works, our brains make a lot of boo-boos. They make a lot of errors. Okay, and so when we look at heuristics, when we go with that 12, 13, 14, or that ABC, that's kind of the fast part of our brain, just looking at something and making a quick decision. And we do this all the time to conserve energy. Okay, we do this all the time to conserve energy, yet when we start to think about things, we need to kind of slow down and make some calculations, what have you. So I think my next one here is another example. A bat and ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So I want to find out what the ball costs, and I want to find out what the bat costs. So how much does the ball cost? Anybody?
$0.10.
10 cent, thank you, Worley, is the answer that I was looking for you to give me, but it's incorrect. Okay, and the reason is the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So if the bat costs $1 more, that means it would be $1.10, and in total, That would be $1.20, which is not the $1.10. It's one of those cases, thank you, Worley, where our brain makes a quick decision and it looks like that 10 cents is correct, when in reality, it is a nickel. And all that happens, and I mean, Worley did it, but I'll guarantee 90% of you had the same number. In fact, I'd almost be willing to go almost everybody did. That's the fast part of your brain, not making decisions. So when in economics, I assume, oh, you make rational choices. Sometimes you have to kind of slow down and think, and those rational decisions we in economics want to give you credit for aren't always there. Okay, don't always exist. That's just one example. Okay, here's another one. It takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets. How long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets?
I know what I want to say, but I know it's wrong.
What do you want to say?
I want to say 100 minutes.
Exactly. It's going to take 5 minutes. Okay? Because 5 machines are making 5 of them in 5 minutes. So 100 machines would make 100 in also 5 minutes. But your gut wants to tell you, and your brain does this to you all the time. I think the last one of these, and thank you, Worley, you're both stepping in, but you're illustrating my point perfectly, and everybody's thinking exactly what you're thinking. In a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day the patch doubles in size. It takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake. How long would it take for the patch to cover half the lake? Go ahead. Anybody?
47.
47 days. Okay, because what's going to happen on that last day? It's going to double. And the same thing applies to things such as, you know, if your kids ever come to you with this one, just say no. Dad, I want an allowance of $0.01 a day, and I want you to double it every day for 1 month. Okay. You start off and you go, well, $0.01 a day, that's, you know, big deal. 2 cents on day 2, big deal. Double it 4 cents on day 3, big deal. Okay. It's not until you get to week 3 and 4 where all of a sudden you're talking some significant money. Okay. The first week costs you nothing. The last week will bankrupt you, even at just $0.01 a day, doubling every day. So we have to be careful with what we think or how we think and how we go about things. Okay. Some confirmation bias. Okay. You do well or you do poorly on an exam, and you do poorly on the next exam. All of a sudden you think that on the next exam you're also going to do poorly. Okay, and it works the other way is, and keep in mind, businesses do this more so than, you know, a lot of things. You see businesses that are always, if you will, make success, always have the successful, you know, sales presentation or whatever. They don't even consider that it's not going to happen. Basketball players. Okay, we're coming up on March Madness, whatever. The overconfidence effect. You hit the first couple shots, and if you've ever been an athlete, you know this. You hit the first couple shots, what starts going through your head is, I'm going to throw up everything and anything and everything because nothing's going to miss. Okay. On the other hand, you see some great shooters. Okay. And you see these great shooters, and they miss the first one and they miss the second one. And thank God, a lot of times what they do is they keep shooting the ball. Okay. Why? Because they know that or from their perspective, that can't continue. Although we all know that athletes in particular go on hot streaks and cold streaks. Okay. So you have a couple of successes in a row, that failure doesn't even come to mind. And businesses often do this by what we call the planning fallacy. You make decisions based upon delusional optimism rather than rationally weighing the gains and the losses and probabilities. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with small business owners, and small business owners, I'd argue, perhaps fall into this a little bit more than big, corporations. But they focus on, some delusional optimism. Hey, I'm going to start a small business in Clifton Forge or in Covington that's going to put in there whatever you want. Okay. You ask them how much their sales are going to be. Okay. And they go, oh, we're going to do X amount of X thousands of dollars. And then you boil it down to, what does it mean, to have a pizza place or whatever that makes, 400 grand a year. Well, that means you got to do sales of 1,000 a night. Okay. And at, $10 a pie, you got to sell 100 pies a day. Is that possible in Clifton Forge? And the answer is probably no. You might be able to do it on a Friday, Saturday. But what happens is we fall into this, and we know that it happens from an economic perspective. It's just really hard from a business perspective and from an individual perspective to handle that. And most businesses, okay, especially small businesses, when you go through, some of those like think tanks or some of those organizations that the entrepreneurship classes on campus or what have you, you start looking at their business plan and it's like, really? How are you going to do that? And another thing that happens, and I mean, I have here vaccine, and I could do it in a bunch of different ways. And in fact, my next slide, I believe, has it. Okay. How you frame things and how the newspaper and the news and Yahoo and Google or Facebook, wherever you get your news from, frames things. Okay. If you go that you have 0.001 chance, it's not going to happen. Go back a couple of weeks ago. A once in 100-year flood. It couldn't possibly happen 2 or 3 times in my lifetime. Baloney. Okay. If I put it as 0.001, you don't think about it. When I all of a sudden put, 1 in 100,000, it's like, oh man, is that worth it? Okay. Is it worth it? Another way to do it, okay? And I've seen some of this with crime statistics, what have you, which is where I've drawn this example. Patients similar to Mr. Jones, and this is discharging a patient, okay, although it could have been a crime stat as well, okay, have a 10% probability of committing an act of violence against others during several months after discharge, okay? When you see it that way, you go, give the guy a shot. There's only a 10% chance, right? But when you put it, out of every 100 patients, 10 are going to commit a violent act, then it's like, oh, maybe we better not let him do it. Maybe we better not, release him from jail or, release him from, whatever type of, patient he was. So how it's framed matters to how our brains think about it. When we do things this way, we think of it very personally. Oh, 10 out of 100. It's still only 10%, folks. It's still only 10%, but it's a lot different than saying there's a 10% chance. And so part of what economics has done over the last 20 years, perhaps, or what have you, is we've started to look more at this behavioral economics, is that how we frame things matters. Okay, how we frame things matters. One other kind of point that kind of hits home, this week, supposedly there are going to be checks coming out for, I think about $1,400 per person, if my memory and what I've been told is correct. Okay, that sounds pretty good. On the one hand. On the other hand, let's take Mr. Sass, for example. In order for the government to send me that $1,400 check, anybody want to hazard a guess how much they're increasing the debt by per person? Mr. Sass is crazy enough, he'd figure out the number. It's approximately $5,000. So the government is borrowing $5,000 in money to send you $1,400. And then, as I texted my kids, once again, the curse of being Mr. Sass's kids, okay, as I texted them and I said, look, I'm in my late 50s. The chances of the government being able to raise my taxes enough to come up with that extra $5,000 is virtually zero. So Mr. Sass is going to get the check. And I told my kids, my grandchild's only 1. He's probably really getting it. Okay, my son goes, I'm not even going to tell him, But I'm sending that, in my case, for my wife and I, that $10,000 check to my kids. Bill, pardon me, not a check, a bill. Because that's how much the debt's going up. Okay, and then, if you wanted to get, my mom was calling and she goes, what are they doing? Now, I realize there are people out there that need the money, okay, that are hurting, that need the money for food and whatever else. But I'm telling you, if we told everybody that, yeah, we can send you a check for $1,400, but it's going to cost $5,000. And for anybody over, I'm going to say 50, you're adding that to the debt of your kids and your grandkids, because there's just not enough time for us to tax you enough to get it back. I wonder how you'd feel about it then. And would you feel the same way as if it's, oh, here's $1,400? Another way to think about things. 2 weeks ago, we talked about, utility. Okay, and think about utility in terms of these two people. Jack and Jill each have wealth of $5 million today. We would think they should be just as happy. They should have just as much, to use the word from a couple of weeks ago, utility. Until I tell you, yesterday Jack had $1 million, Jill had $9 million. Jack is feeling really good. Jill is feeling not quite so good. Okay. Even though they both have the same. Why? Because you frame it. How you frame things matters. I'll give you an example of how they frame it for you guys here in a couple of minutes. Okay. When you judge things, you judge good and bad things in relative terms, such as gains or losses. Go back to that $1,400. People are going to feel good about getting $1,400 per person in their checking account. Until you tell them, hey, it's going to cost you and your grandkids $5,000. And look at how this impacts our choices. Anthony currently has wealth of $1 million. Betty's is 4 million. I offer them a head flip. Okay, a head flip, no, a coin flip. Okay, they have a choice. Heads 1 million, tails 4, or they can take a sure thing of 2. Those are your choices. Anthony's going to be tempted to take the sure thing. Why? He's still better off. Okay. Yeah, he gave up the chance for the 4 mil. But he already has twice as much. On the other hand, Betty is going to flip the coin. Why go from 4 to 2? At least I've got a chance of staying at 4. I hate the lottery. And it's not because I've got some moral aversion to gambling. I really don't care. Okay? But what bugs me is that most of the people, and I'm going to use the lottery here, okay? I'm not going to talk about going to the casino and, playing blackjack or whatever. I'm going to talk about the lottery, the, Mega Millions or what have you. The majority of people that play that are, relatively speaking, poor people. Why? Because I'm going to risk 10 or 20 bucks or whatever, but I could make, 500 million. Somebody that's already got $1 million, big deal. Why risk it? Okay, so the studies and the evidence says that the most people that play the lottery are the poor, those that can least afford it. Okay, and what really irks me is a lot of times the states sell these lotteries. Oh, we're going to have a lottery, what have you. And by the way, the money is going to go to fund local schools. That sounds really good. Until you realize it's more often just a way to take money from poor people and funnel it into rich districts. My kids have long since left high school, what have you. And when they were in high school, one of the fundraisers was to run bingo nights down in Roanoke. And call me lazy, I wasn't going to do it. And I told the coach, told the principal, told everybody who'd listen that I thought it was morally bankrupt for one of what one could argue were the wealthier districts in Southwest Virginia, going down to one of the poorest areas in Virginia, or in Southwest Virginia. It was Happy's on Williamson Road there, before they tore it down or what have you, for a bingo night to raise money so that my kids could play soccer or football or whatever it was. It's like, really? Talk about taking from the poor and giving it to the rich. And that's what happens with things like the lottery and what have you. And it's not because I'm, going to get on my high horse about I don't care. But it's just morally wrong to go and take from the poorest. And yet that's what they do. We find this with anchoring with credit card bills all the time. When your credit card bill comes, take a look. It'll always say your balance, and your balance might be $4,000 or something, I don't know. And it'll say your minimum payment is 50 bucks. And then what happens is you go, the minimum payment's 50, I'm going to give them 100. Aren't I being good? Excluding interest, folks, On a $4,000 balance, if you paid off $100 a month, you charged nothing else, and you paid, no interest, it would take you 40 months, almost 4 years to pay it off. And that's assuming no interest, and it's assuming you don't charge anything else. Why do those credit card companies want to keep that minimum payment down as low as possible? So that when you pay a little more, you feel good about yourself. Keep in mind, they are required now in most states, I believe, to tell you that, hey, it's going to take you, 40 months to, pay off that bill. Okay, 4 years. And keep in mind, we do this all the time. Okay, you also have mental accounting. Okay, and we find this all the time in the stock market and what have you. What happens, and I'm gonna see if I can go back here. What happens in mental accounting is you just bought a stock. This is a stock. This is its price. These are days, and you bought a stock up here at $50, and then it's gone down, and it's gone down to 40, and then it went down to 30. And you hang on, and you hang on. And what we find is that a lot of individual investors hang on to losing stocks. What are they waiting for? They're waiting for it to get back to 50. And then as soon as it gets up to 50, they sell it. Hey, I broke even. I didn't lose any money. Okay, I didn't lose any money. One other kind of interesting idea here that I think we all ought to go ahead and take a look at. Suppose you have $100 and you lose 50%. So now you have $50. How much does it have to go back up percentage-wise to get back to 100? Any brave souls?
100%.
50%. Oh,
It's got to go up 100%. Bingo. Most people go, oh, I lost 50%. I only have to get 50% back. Nope. You got to get 100% because the only way to get, so, those losses can be very painful. And so look at what happens. And you see this if you talk to stockbrokers or financial planners, what have you, you see this all the time. You need money to cover the cost of your daughter's wedding. You have some stock to sell. Okay. In fact, we're going to have 2 stocks, but you remember the price at which you bought each stock and can identify it as a winner, currently worth more than you paid for it, or as a loser. So you've got these 2 stocks. Blueberry Tiles is a winner. Tiffany Motors, which is currently also worth $5,000, is worth less. The value of both stocks has been stable. What one are you more likely to sell? What we find is that people are more likely to sell their winners. Why? Because then you can strut around and say, hey, I'm a good stock picker. I sold my winner. I paid for my daughter's wedding with that. Okay. Whereas if I sell the 5,000 that went down with Tiffany Motors, and keep in mind, they're worth the same amount. Man, I lost money on it. It's the same $5,000, folks. Okay. You talk to anybody that's been in the stock market a long time. Quick note, I am. Okay. I've been a member of the Chicago Board Options Exchange, Chicago Stock Exchange, what have you. Okay. Most of the professionals, if you talk to them about their method, it's let your winners run and cut your losses. But yet what most people will do is cut their winners short and hang on to their losers. That's not what the pros do. It makes sense from an economic heuristics, behavioral economics perspective. It doesn't make sense for making money. Notice this data on organ donors. Okay, I'm going to start about halfway down. Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Sweden, all between 80 and 100%. Portugal, the US, what have you. Are they really that much different than Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany? And the answer is no. It all depends, and this is getting to my nudge, okay, what the nudge is. People tend to stick with whatever option is presented as the default. If the default option is participation, you participate because you have to opt out. The 4 countries with low percentages, that's where the option is not participating. You have to opt in. You would think they should be the same or very similar, but they're not, and they're very different. Okay. And so now when you go to DMV, what have you, a lot of times in most states, I believe, they ask you, do you want to be an organ donor? Okay. Now it's not quite a default, but rather than opt in, they're asking. We'll talk about organ donors and what have you last week of class when we talk healthcare. Questions? Keep in mind, we all fight some self-control problems. Okay. I don't know if anybody does, but I mean, back in the day, you used to hide the alarm clock. Okay. Why? Because it was so hard to get up in the morning. Automatic payroll deductions. Now, the example I'm going to use has just been changed by that law that went through Congress last week, but folks were shocked. In fact, a friend of ours, our daughter's, was shocked when he learned that unemployment benefits were taxable. It's like, yeah, you could have gotten, you could have had them withhold the income tax, or you could have gotten the full amount and put 10% of it, whatever that would be. If it checks for $400, put $40 in an envelope to pay the taxes when they come due in April. Most people didn't do that. That's why they do those automatic payroll deductions for things like income tax and what have you. Salary smoothing. Faculty are 9-month faculty. We have a choice. Most states, I believe, now do. You can get paid over 9 months or 12. When I was full-time faculty in Wisconsin, I was paid over 9, and my wife hated it because usually you don't get the first check until like September 1st or September 15th. And by about the 1st of August, it's like you're looking at the checkbook and it's like, there's not enough to go around. Okay. So what do they allow us to do? What do they allow faculty to do? Spread it over 12. Why? It helps. You get paid the same amount. There's no difference. It'd be really easy to just put it aside. Okay. But it creates issues. So my point is that these things come up every day. Okay. And from an economics perspective, it's important for us to understand that. And perhaps in some ways, and in some cases, okay, to use nudges, okay, to help people make the right decision. Because in economics, I want to leave everything to the individual. I want to assume that each and every one of you knows what's absolutely best for you. That's what my heart tells me I want to do. But then I look at the reality of it and I say, a lot of you aren't going to save enough for retirement. Maybe we need to nudge you to make those right decisions. A lot of you aren't going to, have the money to pay for the health care or whatever else, the deductible or the cap or the crown. Maybe we need to, have some way to do those types of things, to nudge you in the right decision. Okay. There's also study in the field of what's fair. You see, if we take a look at pure economics, giving to charity does not make a ton of sense. The neoclassic, if you will. And the reason is, unless you get pleasure out of giving your money to somebody else and not getting the utility from it, what have you, but we know that people do. Okay. Obeying the law. How many times have you been sitting there? Hopefully many of you have, going 55 in the left-hand lane, or pardon me, in the right-hand lane, and you see the guy going zipping past you. And all you go is, I hope he gets caught. And all I can tell you is that I'll never forget the day my daughter called me up and she goes, Dad, it finally happened. The guy went zipping past me, and sure enough, 3 miles down the road, I saw him pulled over, cop behind him. I couldn't have been more happy. It kind of makes me feel both, it makes us feel good on the one hand. It kind of makes us feel sad because we're wishing the other guy, if you will, gets the ticket. Okay. Purchasing fair trade products, the coffee or what have you. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk about, buying those shirts or what have you that were made in a sweatshop in, Indonesia someplace, or in China, wherever they may have been. So what we try to do in economics then is to find a way to nudge people towards choices that are better for themselves. We're all better off if we nudge people towards being organ donors. We're all better off if we nudge people to save money for retirement. And I think most of you, when I was reading the discussion boards, whatever, most of you were going along. Hey, as long as it's not required, as long as they come out and say you should save, and the right number is usually, I hate to tell you folks, 10%. You should be saving 10% of your income for retirement. Okay. Now, many of you will go, but I can't afford that. I got to pay rent. I need to put food on the table for the kids. Okay. I can't afford 10%. The problem is, a lot of times what we do is we don't have a nudge, and so we save 0. Whereas if we have a nudge and we say the automatic deduction is 10%, there are a lot of people that'll take that automatic deduction and just live with it, won't even think twice, what have you. Some will knock it down to 5%. Some might go all the way down to 0. But we find, just like the evidence with the organ donors, it has a drastic difference. Okay, or it can make a drastic difference. Questions? Quick note about our discussion boards. Okay. There was the one, and there was only one this week on, and I sent you all an email on it. There was the one on nudges. Okay. And the thing to realize about nudges is we have them and use them all the time. Okay. And I think the article mentioned, if I recall correctly, the nudges when you drive down the street, those yellow lines that go down the middle, are nudges to keep you on your side. The blinking light when you come to the walk, don't walk sign. Just watch somebody one time. Okay. As it starts to blink that it's going to turn from walk to don't walk, they speed up. Okay. Those nudges work. And so then the question becomes, where else can we and should we use nudges? And one of them that we see more and more today are retirement savings. Okay. And the nudge is you have the states are requiring you have to save X%. Okay. X% is the automatic amount that's going to be withheld from your check. And if you want less than that, you have to make a conscious decision, go to HR, fill out the paperwork, what have you. Okay. That is opposed to your nudge is you're saving 0. Okay. And if you want to save more than that, you have to go down to HR and bump it up. Okay. You would think both would yield the same result, but they don't. Okay. But they don't. Another one, and I'm going to talk about it once again last week in class, I would argue is healthcare, specifically insurance. There is not one person who in their lifetime will not need healthcare. Okay, not one. Everybody at some point is going to need it. The problem is that for a lot, especially of young, healthy people, I have a choice between paying $500 a month. That might be too much, might be too little. I'm not going to argue price. Just go with my example. For insurance, that for the most part, young people don't need. Let's be honest, they're young, they're relatively healthy. Or spend $500 a month on vacation. Trips to Florida, Greece, put in there whatever you want. The beaches of South Carolina, Outer Banks, skiing. When I phrase it this way, those are your choices. Most, especially young people, are going to choose that, knowing full well if they go to the hospital, they're going to be covered. There's going to be, they're not going to have to worry about it. And the chances of them needing it, other than for a broken arm or what have you, is relatively slim. Why spend $500 on insurance? What have you? I would argue that part of, Obamacare, the Healthcare Act, what have you, was a nudge. And keep in mind, everybody is better off if everybody has healthcare insurance. Because for those that don't have healthcare insurance, that show up at the emergency room and need the arm set or whatever else, it's paid for. Let's not fool ourselves. It gets paid for. It gets paid for with everybody that does have health insurance. So we drive up their costs. So I would argue that one of the purposes, if you will, of the Healthcare Act back in 2008, 2009, I guess 2009, maybe 2010, was to be a nudge. And I'd point out, we had no problem nudging on retirement savings. Okay, a lot of countries in the world we saw had no problem nudging for organ donations. But heaven forbid we nudge for health insurance. I know it's expensive. It creates all sorts of issues. Questions? What this all means for us, or where it's headed for us, what have you, is it means, and I'm going to call it old school versus new school. Your book uses neoclassic and behavioral, okay? Old school assumed you were rational. Okay, you made rational choices. Here we assume you make choices that are not necessarily rational. Okay, it doesn't make a lot of sense to buy the candy bar necessarily, what have you. And so it's kind of a new, different area of economics, if you will. Questions? Next week, whoops. Our focus changes. Okay, next week our focus changes. Next week we go, so far everything we've done has been pretty much either basic economics, okay, or if you wanted to argue about the individual. Next week the focus changes to business, and we're going to stick there for the rest of the semester. Okay. Next week is our change of focus. And what we're going to talk about next week are costs. Okay, what we're going to talk about next week are costs, specifically business costs. What do fixed, variable, marginal, average, what do those cost curves look like? And we are going to graph them, and we are going to graph quite a few of them. Okay, we are going to graph quite a few of them. So our homework for next week is as follows. We're going to do the assignment. On behavioral economics. Okay, and I don't have them posted yet. I'll get them posted, if not today, tomorrow morning. Okay, we're going to do the assignment on behavioral economics. We are going to do the Learn Smarts on cost. Okay, I'm going to do the Learn Smarts on cost, and I am probably also going to open up the Learn Smarts on the next chapter as well, which is perfect or pure competition. I'll probably open those up, but I will leave them for the next week to be due. Okay, so the real items that are going to be due is the assignment on behavioral econ and the Learn Smart on cost. There is no discussion board next week. Okay, there is no discussion board articles next week. There are none of those. And the only other thing to point out is that if I lose you next week, I've probably lost you for 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, because everything that we talk about next week, we're going to talk about when we talk about pure competition. We're going to talk about it in monopoly. We're going to talk about it again in oligopoly. We're going to talk about it in monopolistic competition. So it is going to continue to come back, and I'm going to say haunt us for the next 4 or 5 weeks. Questions? Once again, I hope you all had a great spring break.